Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm Doug Birkey, Executive Director at the Mitchell Institute. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. Uncrewed aircraft, they're a key component of tomorrow's Air Force. We hear about types like collaborative combat aircraft, the FQ-42 and FQ-44 all the time. President Trump talked about them when he announced the F-47 NGAD program was rolling forward, and we certainly see our adversaries are moving this way too. However, uncrewed systems aren't new. The U.S. has been the global leader in this zone for decades. We've dabbled in this field going all the way back to World War II, but things really ramped up in the months right after 9/11 when the MQ-1 Predator redefined elements of modern air power. It was followed by the larger, more capable MQ-9 Reaper. And the RQ-4 Global Hawk, it's also been a key part of this construct too. Plus, the RQ-170 gives us a glimpse of what penetrating uncrewed systems might look like. And there are a lot of other systems out there that are classified. So bottom line, a ton of activity in this zone. And that's what we're here to discuss today. We've got our very own Brigadier General Houston Cantwell with us to explore his perspectives as a pilot, commander, and now a member of the Mitchell Institute team, thinking about what it means to further advance in this world of uncrewed air power. And as you know, he began his career in the F-16, but he later moved to the MQ-9 and then the RQ-4. It's a tremendous range of insight because he knows what it means to strap into the jet and launch on a combat sortie, but he also knows what it's like to operate an unmanned aircraft in harm's way. So with that, Houston, thanks for being here.
Hey, great to be here, Doug. Thanks.
So first off, I really want to thank you for sharing these experiences. The fact that you've got firsthand insights in both these worlds is so unique. And it really allows for a range of insights where normally people are on one side or the other, but for you to have views on both, it's just incredible. So thanks so much. So to kick this off, I'd like to help the audience understand these two worlds from a human experiential level. Can you help us compare what it was like to strap into the Viper versus enter the ground station for a Reaper to fly a sortie? They're both forms of frontline air power, but the experience, it's way different, I'd assume.
Yeah, I'm really glad you started off this way. As the vice superintendent over at the Air Force Academy, this was the most common question that I would get from the cadets. I mean, these are kids trying to figure out, what are we going to do for the rest of my life? And the fact that I had done both, they wanted to get my insights and go, which path do I want to take as a cadet? So flying jets, it's just simply more personal. You build a relationship with that machine. I mean, think about the guys in World War II, the nose art. They would name their aircraft. I personally remember landing in Misawa, northern Japan, in the middle of snowstorms on an icy runway, barely coming to a stop by the end of the runway thinking, phew, that was close. And you think, wow, I just defeated the weather. I overcame the odds, came home safe, got the mission done. I'll just say in the unmanned aircraft, it's not quite that way because your life is never actually on the line and you're sitting in a ground control station on the ground, you can actually go years without actually seeing the aircraft. And so there are times when guys will be flying combat missions for years at a time, but because they're in, let's say, Las Vegas and the aircraft are in Afghanistan, you just never actually see your aircraft.
Now, we've talked about this before when, believe it or not, we're coming up to a point where types like Predator and Reaper, they're coming up for museum displays, in fact. And it's important we do that. But when we ask folks like, hey, what are the historic tales? Which tales did what missions that we should really preserve? We get a lot of blank stares.
Sometimes you got to do some digging because you got to really look in the records because they may not know because they don't know what tail number they were on when they flew that really important mission. And that's one other thing I want to point out about the mission itself. Although the physical experience may be completely different, flying manned versus unmanned, the mental strain when you're doing a close air support mission is exactly the same because you are right there. You are talking to the JTAC. There are lives on the line and you are about to employ lethal force on behalf of your nation.
Wow. Yeah. So taking what you just said there, let's break this down from an effects perspective. I mean, at the end of the day, a missile comes off a rail and we net an effect. And the missile really doesn't know or care what it came off of. It could have been your F-16 or your MQ-9. But what does that mean for the pilots and the involved crews? I mean, you said in one sense it feels the same, yet on the other hand, I would question that a little bit. I mean, in that Viper, you're zipping along a couple of miles an hour. You're juggling a lot of things real time. And in the ground control station, it's a different set of sensors that are giving you data streams and all that there've got to be different challenges and opportunities with each type of scenario. Am I wrong?
Yeah, for sure. Let's highlight the fact that this conversation we're having right now is going to generally focus on one specific tactical scenario. And that is going to be a permissive environment doing close air support, because that's essentially what the Reaper and honestly a lot of the Vipers have done while in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, last
So
20 years.
exactly. I have to tell you, when I started this whole journey and they told me about this thing called the Hellfire missile, I kind of laughed and scoffed at it, because in the Viper we're flying Maverick missiles, and those had 250 pounds of explosive, and this Hellfire had 20 pounds. And it just didn't seem like it could do much. But I'm here to tell you that the Predator, with its persistence and its precision, allowed pilots, allowed crews actually, because the sensor operator was absolutely vital in the tactical success of this platform, to succeed every time. And in the future, we're going to have to look at who's going to be providing that end game guidance. Because is it going to be a man or is it going to be a machine? Right now, whether it's manned or unmanned, we are letting a human being provide end game guidance for these air to ground engagements. The sensor operator guides it all the way in. You've got the F-16 pilot using a laser guided bomb that's guiding it in. Or maybe they've typed in the coordinates for a GPS guided munition. But again, essentially, it is the human is deciding where is that weapon going to go. What's going to happen in the future? I don't know.
Yeah. No, you're hitting on a really key point, and that's information's role in the experience. And that's really what gets you combat success. You know, we talk about it with OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. But how do you compare that process if you're in a manned aircraft versus an unmanned one?
Well, I think essentially the military is going to have to decide, carefully consider what decisions are going to remain human and what decisions go to the machine. And this is going to have to be, maybe the battle space becomes too dangerous for humans. Maybe directed energy, the next generation of surface to air missiles, whatever that may be, maybe it's too dangerous. So we retrograde the humans just outside of that super WES, whatever that may be. And then we have to decide what decisions are going to be made at the edge of the battle space. And maybe the computers need additional computing power. Maybe we need the supercomputers that are really at the edge, that have data links that allow unprecedented amounts of data to go into those decisions. These are concepts that we haven't really thought through. We haven't wargamed. But as we start to mix manned and unmanned systems, it's going to come to the fore, and we're going to be able to wargame this kind of thing.
So on the information piece, when you're strapped into the jet, you obviously have a lot of real time, almost like subconscious awareness, where you know what direction you're pointed. If there are assets that you can visually see, you got them off your wing or whatever. But there's a lot going on. I mean, the task saturation of just keeping that jet going the right way at high speed and all that, that's challenging. In an unmanned asset, you have tremendous sensors, but you don't have that subconscious, just there I am strapped in, we're going along. What does that feel like? What's the difference when you're executing that mission? Because you might have been staring through that video feed and you've built pattern of life and you have tremendous SA that way. But there's common sense stuff that, like, if we're driving down the highway, you just kind of know what's around you. You don't have that, right? Am I wrong? Or does that affect the mission?
Yeah, for sure. Flying the F-16, kind of interesting that one of the things you're most concerned about is running into another airplane. And I remember in Afghanistan, ironically, I almost ran into an MQ-1 because we were all stacked above the target, getting a 9 line from someone on the ground. And honestly, I don't know if he was a little bit out of his block or I was a little bit out of my block, but I went beak to beak with an MQ-1. That MQ-1 probably never even knew that I was there.
Yeah.
But it made my blood pressure go up, I can tell you that much. But
Wow.
going back to what you're saying, your global situational awareness, you have more intelligence feeds when you're on the ground as an MQ-1 pilot than you do as an F-16 pilot. Now, I think the 5th gen fighters, certainly the 6th gen fighters, are going to have access to data links that we just don't have access to now. But that's going to introduce the importance of the electromagnetic spectrum to allow those electrons, to allow those data links to go freely across the battle space.
Yeah.
Which right now we take for granted because we've been fighting in a combat situation where we have free use, not only air superiority, but spectrum superiority. And moving forward, those two are going to be challenged in ways we haven't even seen before.
No, that's really fascinating. How does this come into play when you're talking about teaming with other assets in the theater? I mean, we've been doing that with crewed aircraft since World War One. And what does it mean when you look at teaming with uncrewed types?
Yeah, this was exceptionally challenging with the MQ-1 and MQ-9, given the speed differentials that those persistent platforms brought compared to fourth gen and fifth gen fighters. But I will tell you, we made some success. You mentioned the RQ-170 earlier. It travels at a much faster speed than these propeller-driven aircraft, and some deliberate efforts have been made to incorporate that unmanned platform into what you've just been talking about, which are these large strike packages, which is exactly how we've practiced in the past. I'll push back slightly because I wonder if we're asking the right question, because historically, the U.S. Air Force has relied solely on speed and mass. So it's like a football play. We get everybody up to the line of scrimmage. We know what the play is going to be. Quarterback says, ready, ready, hike. And at that point, everyone executes violently and as fast as possible against the enemy to overwhelm them. And it's kind of like a football play. But in the future, maybe it's going to be more like soccer. Maybe as we get into these protracted engagements, there's going to be intelligence being collected across the battle space from both air, space, sea, and land. And we're going to be continuing to look for opportunities across the battle space over long periods of time. And then once we find out where we can exploit that, then we move with speed and maybe with a very small force, whether that's a ground force or an air force, or maybe something from space, and we exploit that advantage in a very precise manner, which would differ vastly from the way we've looked at air power throughout the end of the 20th century.
Yeah. And thinking about my question, I think one of the problems too, and how I'm framing it is that when I say we've been teaming for a long time, it's through one given paradigm that generally happens when you do human to human type teaming relationships, even if you're geographically separated in different assets. What really matters is the effect you want to achieve. The uncrewed types might be using totally different paradigms that suit them, but it's not necessarily going to be somebody on your wing in traditional human teaming fashion. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and the challenge, again, going back to, we've only in mass effects used the MQ-1 and the MQ-9, which generally haven't been put into these large packages to begin with.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So most students at Airpower, they recognize that the MQ-9, we call it uncrewed, but really you are operating it through remote links. I mean, you're in a ground control station and the aircraft could be on the other side of the world, but you are generally operating it. Some things are automated with it for certain aspects of the mission, but you are exercising a lot of direct control. Things like collaborative combat aircraft, they're going to be way more autonomous. You've lived in that world to a degree with Global Hawk and RQ-170. Could you help the audience understand what this means from an operational level and how you think about executing a mission in that more automated world?
Yeah, sure can. I'm going to go real tactical for a second, though, going right into the ground control station. In an MQ-9, you have a control stick and a throttle. Heck, you even have rudder pedals. In a Global Hawk, you have a keyboard and a mouse. That is the only way you can tell the aircraft what to do. So an MQ-9, you can go tell a pilot to go fly a mission, and 10 minutes later, he can hop in a ground control station and control the aircraft however he or she sees best fit. Mm-hmm. In a Global Hawk, the mission planning is extremely arduous because when you decide you want to go do a certain type of mission, you have to plan out every point from the time you start the engine on the ground, plot out every point for the taxi out to the runway, and then every point down the runway, and then while you're airborne, you have to come up with a branch plan for if the engine fails, if you have a malfunction in the navigation system, if you lose your data link, and the aircraft has to have a branch plan for each one of those situations at each point in the mission plan. Mm-hmm. And it takes a very long time to build these mission plans. And so the more automated the aircraft becomes, the more arduous the mission planning is going to become. Now, granted, there's going to become more automated systems, so you'll have computers doing this.
Right.
Right now, it's very manual, but it is a very long process to build these mission plans for the automated aircraft.
So what I'm hearing in many ways is if you're in the Viper or even an MQ-9, almost instincts and just training, you can just go execute based off commander's intent. Global Hawk, it's obviously very nascent, autonomy. And so you literally are building out the plan literally and then different codes depending if
Point by
things
point.
happen. Yeah. So really the next step is going to be trying to allow CCA to operate in a more deliberate fashion without the literal execution every step along the way. Allow it to exercise some AI judgment to a degree to bring it back a little bit more in line with where that F-16 or MQ-9 were, that it can kind of just determine some of that based on more macro inputs.
Exactly. You mentioned the role of artificial intelligence. It'll be interesting how artificial intelligence plays into the airworthiness discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, I mean, rightfully so, the Federal Aviation Administration watches every unmanned aircraft with a hawk because their first priority is safety. And even MQ-9, which is operated very similarly to any manned aircraft, is watched very closely because of that data link that could be severed at any moment.
Right.
We've heard in artificial intelligence that even the folks that write the code for the artificial intelligence can't always tell you definitively why did the artificial intelligence come up with that solution. Right. And so when you're telling an aircraft to fly left or fly right, to climb or descend, the Federal Aviation Administration is going to want to know exactly why is it doing certain things. And that's going to become a challenge.
So getting informed judgment, but it's also predictable enough judgment to do the human teaming or operate amongst human assets that are going to operate a certain way. And it goes back to trust is huge. That's really interesting.
Manage your money on your time with 24/7 digital banking on the PenFed mobile app. Easily make payments, transfer funds, and deposit checks through mobile deposit.
That's music to my ears.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCOA.
So if we think about how we train pilots in the future, it's not just for the human teaming piece. President Trump said it, types like the F-47, they're going to be partnering with uncrewed aircraft. And the same is going to be true for other types, F-35, B-21, F-15EX, whatever. They're going to be doing this manned, unmanned teaming partnership. How are airmen going to have to adapt to maximize the potential inherent in these uncrewed partners while working to mitigate some limitations? We're talking about it right now, where this notion of intuition, how do you handle that? How do you handle trust? What are your thoughts on that? Because I think we're going to be building airmen differently to live in this world.
Right. How do you properly credential an airman? We've been doing pilot training since the beginning of the Air Force. It hadn't changed very much because we're a low-risk organization, and because it's a tried and true process.
Right.
We've created some very successful pilots over the years. When we came up with the RPA pilot training pipeline, we thought, hey, it worked for pilots, helped build airmanship, so let's apply a lot of the same principles to these RPA pilots.
Right.
And so we required them to solo in a Cessna-type aircraft, and then we had them fly a T6 180-degree dome simulator to build their airmanship. Even though when they're flying the RPA, they will never actually have 180 degrees of visibility anywhere.
Right.
And so you bring up a great point. As we continue to go down this automated train, and as we continue to have more and more unmanned aircraft, we're going to have to look back on these training processes and determine how do we actually develop airmanship in our young aviators.
Yeah, because the F-47 pilots need to know how to fly with each other, but they also need to know how to trust and effectively engage with their unmanned teammates, whether they're right off the wing or hundreds of miles away.
Exactly. And some folks have opined, I watch my kids play video games. They play those first-person shooter games. Yeah. And somehow these young kids are able to build a three-dimensional scenario using two-dimensional screens. And I can tell you, as an old guy, when I try to play those games, it is very difficult for me to build that three-dimensional world that these young kids are building like it's an intuition for them.
Right.
And so I think they're onto something, though. Maybe we need to be looking at how do you build a three-dimensional situational awareness off of two-dimensional screens.
Right.
It's a fundamentally different skill set.
Now, and it really brings into play when we talk about 5th gen and 6th gen, they're information dominance machines in many ways way above and beyond just anything that might do as normal airplanes. And so how they manage that information and help the pilot think of that strategic level real time is going to be very different when they're dealing with the unmanned players.
It's going to be very different. And the new challenge that's going to come into that is you've got, as a pilot flying the F-47, you're very concerned about the health and well-being of that F-47 because your safety is directly tied to that.
Right.
But then you've got these uncrewed wingmen that are massing your effects. Well, how much responsibility do you have for those aircraft?
Right.
Last time I checked, the United States Air Force puts one pilot in command for each aircraft. Is this F-47 pilot going to be the pilot in command of the unmanned aircraft on his wing as well?
Right.
Or is there going to be a second pilot that's on the ground somewhere that is doing the administrative portions and has the overall safety and well-being of that unmanned aircraft for their responsibility?
Yeah.
These are important discussions that are going to have to go on as we continue the development of these very advanced systems.
Yeah, and if you layer in how contested the electromagnetic spectrum is going to be, I think that's why we're talking about the AI, because these aircraft are going to have to work off a command intent and have some autonomy, literally, because whether they're connected or not is going to be different. And certainly the type of scenario you talked about with Global Hawk would not work for the pilot of the F-47. They cannot literally type out these very deliberate commands. I mean, it's just, they got to say, go do this, and it just knows how to do that. And it's going to develop the best way to do that given real-time circumstances.
So that becomes one of the other large challenges facing us is, from what I've seen, again, I've been MQ-9, RQ-4, F-16. There has not been enough research when it comes to workload on the human.
Right.
So you've got a human flying an airplane. What additional processes can that human take on when it comes to other aircraft?
Yep.
And we need to have simulators. We need to have exercises where we test this.
Right.
Whether it's at test pilot school or whether it's at who knows what scenario this is, but we have to run this through and become experts.
Yep.
We need to be the leading experts around the world of how do we build operators that can fly one machine and then control either the weapons of another machine, the sensor of another machine, and how is that information best presented to the decision maker, and when is that information presented?
Yeah. And I think, too, the operating assumption. So if you think about an F-22 over Syria, they had dominance. I mean, those guys are home free. They could really think about the broader strategic environment. Whereas if you're over Beijing, you're worried about staying alive. I mean, how contested that'll be, you're just trying to get through it alive and not get shut down. And I'm almost reminded of scenarios that I've chatted about with Vietnam air pilots, that when they were in high threat zones, the task saturation for just executing the core mission was so extreme that they began, without even knowing it, load dumping, and they would not hear very deliberate radio calls saying, hey, a MiG is on your tail or a SAM just launched at you. And they got shot down, and they never heard the call. Yeah. Which brings into question, and you want these guys to operate CCA on top of it?
And so now you have an F-35 or an F-47 pilot in the missile engagement zones being fired at. Yeah. And you've also got degraded electromagnetic spectrum. So you don't even know what commands are making it to your unmanned wingman or not. And then you got to figure out, all right, if I lose data link, what are my unmanned wingmen programmed to do at this particular moment in time? That is a lot for someone to process.
And that's why it cuts to why the AI portion of this is so critical. And we have to be very careful about the paradigms we're using. Where Global Hawk, I mean, it blew people's minds how sophisticated that was when it first came out. I remember when it flew around the world, I think it was landing in Australia or something, and it nailed the center line. I mean, Avweek wrote an article about this. It was unreal. And hats off to those folks who did that. But that was over 20 years ago. And where we're having to go now and the pressures, I mean, it's absolutely a completely different game. And we need to be very careful about the paradigms we're using so that we're not trying to, proverbial square peg, round hole kind of deal. We've got to be, what's the effect we want? And then you build backwards off of that to ensure you're doing it, to ensure you're doing it in a way that optimizes the end goals, not just aiming for some process that might be obsolete.
As we try to figure out how do we adopt what has been a very successful brief, execute, debrief mantra in the single-seat fighter community, I want to bring in some comments that General Costello once made when he was the Air Force A3.
Fighter pilots, fighter pilots.
So I was at an AFA convention. I was just in the audience, and General Costello was talking about, hey, we've got these new concepts out on the ramp. They're going to be called CCAs, and they're going to be these loyal wingmen. And I don't know about you guys, but it's going to be great because right now, fighter debriefs, they're hours and hours long. But now that I won't have that lieutenant in the debrief room with me, it'll just be me by myself. I can just tell the machine that it got screwed up and then basically walk out. So debriefs essentially get so much easier. And of course, the audience thought it was really funny. And honestly, I thought it was pretty funny too. But as I look back on my experience as an RQ-4 pilot who flew a completely automated system, I actually think we're going to wish we had that lieutenant in the debriefing room because I can tell a lieutenant what they messed up and from pilot to pilot, tell them, here's what you need to do next time to do better. But now I have to tell a software engineer, hey, here's what I need the system to do. And that is a totally new challenge that operators, whether it's a fighter pilot, a bomber pilot, a navigator, weapon systems operator, we don't speak that language.
Right.
And the computer software engineers don't speak our language.
Right.
So now we need to get some interpreters to allow this iterative process that we've done so well in the combat air forces for years. We have to bring in a technologist to translate this into real weapons effects using software. And that's going to be a new challenge.
That's wild. And it also brings into play why the software and the AI is going to be so dynamic, and you're going to want to update it real time.
It has to be dynamic.
Yeah.
If it's not, we don't keep an advantage.
We're not waiting 2 years for a new drop. And it really brings into questions about what do Air Force maintainers do? And it's not just electrical and hydraulics and sheet metal. I mean, they're going to have to excel in this stuff because they're a key part of that enterprise for every sortie.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So this brings up another key point. Too often people focus on the notion of unmanned technology based on goals of getting things cheaper or faster. And I hope that happens. It'd be great. But I think there's some fundamental advantages that uncrewed types are going to bring to the table that go way past that. And it's going to be the fact that we don't have to begin with human factors as a key assumption for the mission, that we can do things very, very differently. And a key example that is pretty obvious is the ranges in the Pacific are massive. And you put a human on an ejection seat in a tight cockpit for 10 hours and they finally just kind of hit the mission area zone. I mean, good luck. I know what I feel like after 10 hours in a road trip and they got to go fight at the highest edge of performance and then go home. CCA does not get tired. There's a benefit to that. But are there other scenarios where you could see this paradigm affording different advantages?
Yeah, I really do. And I think this thought of leveraging the differences could not be more important as we look at the future of unmanned systems. When I was a kid, I used to hear the stories of, oh, well, when we get unmanned systems, they won't be limited to 9 Gs. They can do 12 Gs or 15 Gs. Well, the problem is the engines that can actually sustain 12 to 15 Gs, those are very expensive systems. And so what we're starting to see is, as you just mentioned, endurance is an actual capability that unmanned systems have that are a distinct advantage. Also, how high an aircraft can fly. It's a physiological limitation. If you go above 50,000 feet, you need to be in a spacesuit.
Right.
Or you should be in a spacesuit.
Right.
You could hurt yourself.
Right.
Unmanned systems can fly as long as Bernoulli's principle will let them to, as long as there's air particles up there. And so we need to take advantage. I love flying the RQ-4 because, number one, it was above the thunderstorms. And number two, it was above all commercial traffic. And so you could just point and go wherever you needed to go. And then your fuel burn rates are lower.
Right.
Everything is better above 50,000 feet.
Right.
And yet I don't think we as an Air Force have embraced that because we've had a paradigm since our beginning that most aircraft are manned
Right.
and they operate below 50,000
Right.
feet. And that's just the paradigm. And in fact, if you want to really get busy, operate in the 18 to 28,000 foot regime. That's where everyone wants to be.
Sure. No, and I think this brings in another point too, where we say CCA, and I think we come in to the conversation thinking kind of like a unilateral thing. Like every fighter, we're trying to make it better and to just kind of do these building block approaches and all that. And so we've got F-35, now we've got F-47. We kind of know what they look like and all that. And yet for CCA, we might be building them very, very differently, where we might have some very high performance ones. We might have ones that are very simple and we want different mission attributes on them, but their design, their creation and all, it's going to be very effects based. Or do you want high capability, but maybe low quantity? Do you want lower capability, but tons of quantity that could give you different con-ops? Are they attritable? You name it. That's really going to change how we engage too. So another factor that I think is coming into play here is that CCA are not just a unilateral product. We are going to increasingly be designing them for different desired end state effects. Some are going to be very capable, which is going to probably mean we don't have as many and we're going to want to get them back home safe. Others are going to be cheaper in high volume. Maybe they come back, maybe they don't. We'll see. And others might be purely attritable by design because we want those combat effects. We want them to soak up missiles, you name it. But how do you think that plays into the equation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Doug. There are so many questions surrounding what is the concept of operation that is CCA. Because it's so classified, I think a lot of people are filling in the blanks with their own ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what the concept of operation ends up being, it might be, as you mentioned, the super MES penetrator sometimes. Other times it may be a persistent sensor that is providing multispectral intelligence to a small package of penetrating aircraft that need information that don't want to radiate themselves because they don't want to give away their position. So they're collecting information from this fleet of unmanned aircraft that
Right.
are unafraid to emit and gather information and then send it back to whatever this small package of aircraft are going to be.
Yep.
There's so many opportunities out there. It's only going to be limited by our creativity.
Right. No, it's fascinating stuff. So you've got experience both in manned and unmanned aviation, and clearly we've been talking about it. There are thoughts that you have that are very unique. Are there certain lessons learned you'd like to pass on to the folks working in CCA? I mean, whether they be the technologists innovating the systems or folks in uniform working on ConOps?
Yeah, I think we need to look real carefully at what are the effects that we want to get out of this new unmanned system. The last time we used a penetrating unmanned system to buy down risk was back in Vietnam. We had penetrating spy drones because our aircraft were all getting shot down. So we had these low-level drones that would go try to take pictures, actual optical pictures of the runways and of the SAMs themselves before the manned aircraft would go in. Well, those unmanned systems were not very effective due to a lot of technological advancements that hadn't occurred yet. So we need to decide what processes need to remain with a human and what are we comfortable pushing to a machine. We need to decide what are the edge processes going to be, similar to automated driving. There's going to be situations that the machine may not be programmed for.
Yep.
Elon Musk has been saying there's going to be a fully automated car next year for the last 8 years, and it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And yet he is collecting more data than anyone else through his fleet of Teslas to try to break down every possible situation that could occur in a two-dimensional
Right.
ground, unmanned, or automated car process.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going three-dimensional. Now we're going actual weapons. So you've got lethal force involved. There's going to be a lot of situations that we call edge processes.
Yep.
That it may make most sense for quite some time to keep a human operator in the loop to ensure we get the tactical effectiveness that we need.
Yeah, and you're actually hitting on the point where you've got to actually fly these things a fair amount, because there are some that'll say, oh, we'll just keep them in the box until we need them. No, you actually have to go use them to get the data to improve the AI, I would assume.
Couldn't agree more. Also, Another point about CCA, we've been talking about it for so long. We need to get them on the ramp as soon as possible.
Yeah.
We need to get them on the ramp so we can start figuring out the logistics processes. We need to get them on the ramp, get them in the hands of the warfighter so that we can begin that iterative process that allows the warfighter and allows the developers to work between each other and translate warfighter speak into technological speak.
Right.
And that has to start, and it can't start until you get the actual aircraft in the hands of the warfighter.
No, that's really fascinating. So, as an operator and looking at CCA entering the operational force here pretty soon, how would you advise we grade CCA homework as they progress? I mean, there's obviously going to be an initial capability and then subsequent tranches, but what does good look like for the first tranche, and what should we expect from subsequent ones?
I think it's really important to look at CCA from the perspective of tactical level effectiveness. So without CCA, how effective is the F-35? How effective is the F-47? Okay, now add CCA. How much more effective are these aircraft going to be when you have the team of systems going in against a specific tactical scenario?
Yeah.
If we can say honestly that we're more tactically effective, then we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's what I understand from that Blue Ribbon Commission that evaluated whether we progressed with NGAD. That was one of the key elements as you put them together, and it was exponentially better, but it was that team that made it better. It was not F-47 alone. You had to have the CCA there to really clinch the deal.
Yeah, and Doug, there's going to be some challenges there because we mentioned it before. The challenges associated with the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah.
They're hard to model. It's hard to model effects.
Yep.
It's hard to model when you bring lots of systems together. We had the Israeli attaché here a few months ago.
Yep.
One of the things he said was when all the systems get turned on, it gets really messy.
Yeah.
And if anyone would know, he would know.
No, that's a really good point. Again, why we got to go back to really flying these things and fielding them as fast as possible. And I think it's one of the key reasons, and people need to appreciate this, there is so much more risk in many ways going slow on this than just getting it out there and learning as fast as possible and understanding that the different tranches afterwards are going to absorb those lessons learned. I mean, that's kind of how the SpaceX model worked.
Yeah.
And that's not the way the government likes to go sometimes. So we're getting towards the end of the time block here, but I want to take us back to your personal experiences. Just big picture, what got you into unmanned aviation? I mean, you've been part of this historic rise with this very unique technology. How'd it begin?
Yeah, it's always been a passion of mine for some reason. I honestly can't tell you why, but back in September of 2001, I was an intern in the Pentagon as a captain. And the job of an intern is to go out and learn. And I found a civilian. I said, hey, I've heard about these new airplanes. They're called Predators, and they're like out in Nevada. Would you pay for me to go out there and learn about this? And of course, he thought I just wanted to get to Vegas and go party. But honestly, I just wanted to go out to this place called Indian Springs and go learn about these new aircraft. So he pays a TDY, and I go out there. And on September 7th of 2001, I am out at Indian Springs Airfield.
You gotta be kidding me.
And I'm learning about these new things called Predators, and they sound like lawnmowers in the air. And I got to tell you, it was an unforgettable trip to have my first touch point.
So you saw the real pioneers.
Oh, yeah. It was back, like I said, 2001, or first week of September, and heard the good and the bad and the ugly, everything in the middle. But they were already making an important contribution to our national security, even that early.
Were you blown away when they became national news topics in the subsequent months?
Well, then I was back. So I go out to Vegas, and I'm back in the Pentagon on 10 September. And then, of course, 11 September happens. And then, honestly, the rest is history when it comes to the Predator. Yeah. And it was just fascinating to see that entire community continue to exponentially grow due to the demands being placed on all of those incredibly talented airmen.
It's amazing. So putting your general hat on for a minute, are there thoughts you'd offer leadership as they get ready to take this next step in progressing towards CCA? I mean, what can we do better this time around than things that we did as we kind of worked our way through RPA world under some pretty difficult combat pressures, et cetera.
Yeah, that first trip out to Indian Springs really set the tone for, I'll just say, the frustration and the uncertainty that surrounded that entire career field for decades.
Yep.
And honestly, a lot of that hasn't changed a whole lot.
Mhm.
So if there's one thing I would recommend is keep the RPA community informed as much as possible.
Yeah.
There's so much security and classification around the CCA. We need to break those down. We need to let this community know, let the RPA community know, where are we going with unmanned?
Yeah.
People are going to assume the worst. There's going to be rumors out there. Oh, they're getting rid of the MQ-9. Oh, they're getting rid of the whatever system it is. And if airmen don't see themselves in the future, they will find alternative jobs.
And I think you really want their expertise there, because we're talking about here, you guys from that world see things fundamentally different, and how you see it is so much more aligned with where CCA is going to need to go. And so why would we want to surrender that advantage? I think the RPA community is going to be integral with standing up where CCA goes. It's an experienced bench. Why would you ignore that?
Absolutely integral. These are seasoned and combat proven aviators
Yeah.
that understand weapons effects, understand so much of what makes our Air Force successful,
Yep.
and can help plan that next, whatever the next thing is. And we need to retain that talent as long as we can.
Yeah. Now, you dealt with a lot of industry vendors in your time working RPAs. What lessons learned do you have for them? Because obviously, when we work with CCA, we're asking a lot from industry. I mean, we're pushing the state of the art when it comes to the airframes, the AI, different models we want with more plug and play on the software side and mission systems. Thoughts on advice?
Yeah, I really hope industry can keep the Air Force and the Space Force honest about the importance of the electromagnetic spectrum. We in the Air Force get so focused on what's cool, on the single seat fighters, on what's sitting on the ramp, on the actual weapons effects. How are we going to go downtown, penetrate the WES? How are we going to go actually get bombs on target?
Right.
But in the 21st century, access and use of the electromagnetic spectrum is going to be absolutely essential to our continued success. And many of the companies are doing a great job of coming up with new technologies, of ensuring access to the EM spectrum. But we in the United States Air Force have to continue to develop the young professionals that understand this, can utilize it, and can keep us successful across the EM spectrum at our time and place of choosing.
No, incredibly important. Final thoughts?
Final thoughts. So when I started my research on the unmanned community and began to learn all that I could, I heard stories that broke my heart. Just disgruntled airmen who were frustrated that they had been non-volunteered into the community. And over time, the community has evolved. And the community proved over the last 20 years to be, if you listen to former Undersecretary of Defense Mike Vickers, when he was talking about the global war on terror, he called the Predator Reaper program the most effective tool that the United States had against Al-Qaeda.
Wow.
Truly tremendous. And so it's been an uphill battle when it comes to where has unmanned technologies gone, or where did it start and where is it going?
Mm-hmm.
And the community has faced headwinds.
Yep.
But one of the highlights of my experience in the community was I got to write a paper when I was at Air Command and Staff College. And it was on the history of the Predator. And as part of my research, I got to meet Tex Hill. And Tex Hill, he was probably 91 years of age at the time. This is back in 2005.
And just for everybody's information, he's one of the most famous World War II fighter pilots that existed. He's one of the original Flying Tigers.
So triple ace,
Yep.
credited with 18 kills as a Chenault Flying Tiger. And I wanted to know, what does Tex Hill think of this new technology? The fact that his United States Air Force was going unmanned. And so there I was at his dining room table in Texas, and I turned to him and I go, "Hey, General Hill, I don't know if you've heard, but there's all these new unmanned systems that are being developed. And I was just curious, what are your thoughts on the Air Force adopting all of these new unmanned systems? And he turns up to me and he goes, Houston, I think they're great. They're going to save a lot of lives.
That's incredible. Absolutely incredible.
And I thought that was such an important perspective from someone who had flown in World War II.
Yep.
And lost so many of his friends.
Yep. No, and it comes back to the point of Airpower. The entire reason why the pioneers pushed for it so hard is it's about the combat winning effects. It's not about bleeding out more than the other guy. And if we can get it done smarter and more effectively and more decisively, that's where we need to go for the future. And that's why I think the uncrewed systems are going to be so important. So, dude, we can't thank you enough for your time today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Doug. It's been great.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our listeners for your continued support and for tuning in to today's show. And if you like what you've heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you think we should explore further. And as always, you can join the conversation by following Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.